And looks like we're rolling. Welcome everybody. This is the vcsim deep dive. Uh, this is part of one-off we're doing as SIG VMware for Kubernetes. Doug McEachran is going to show us the VC simulator, which is a vCenter API simulator. Mostly geared towards creating end-to-end test and unit test against the vCenter API. Doug just contributed back to Kubernetes a bunch of tests that are using this new this vcsim. So it's a kind of hot topic for VMware right now. And given that we're working on some new interesting auto tree components like cluster API, cloud provider, CSI, and so on, we want to give everybody like an overview on this tool that can be very powerful to create a portable test against the vSphere endpoint. And this meeting is recorded, and it's going to be available on YouTube, so be mindful of what you share with the team. And that said, I'm going to leave it to you, Doug. Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Fabio. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I only have a handful of slides, but I want to do a little bit of an overview and kind of go straight into running some demos from the command line and then looking at example tests written in Go. And then depending on how much time we have left, we could look at actually extending vcsim to add new functionality. And then discussion, we don't have to wait till the end. Feel free to jump in at any time and with questions or comments. So why are we here at all? It can be very, very challenging to test against vCenter, partly because how long it takes to actually install and boot a vCenter from scratch. There's a lot of disk and memory requirements, and those will increase depending on how many hosts you have, how many clusters you're using vSAN, and so on. And most of the folks on this call probably have some access to vCenter environments in one way or another, but they're probably different and different from each other, and maybe they started the same from tool like Nimbus or Terraform or a set of bash scripts, but then it's going to diverge as you start to use it, and you tend to not want to recycle it because it takes so long to bring it back up again. And not everyone has a vCenter environment, and that's particularly important for something like Kubernetes. There's a cloud provider interface with implementations for vSphere, Amazon, Google, and so on. And there's been cases in the past where refactoring that interface or adding to it has caused the vSphere cloud provider to break. And I would say that's partly because the testing wasn't in place, and that developer working on that feature just doesn't have access to the environment. So what are some of the alternatives to testing against your own vCenter? One is having CI systems that are actually connected to vCenter, and Andrew and Hui I saw are here. I've been doing a lot of work for that on VMC to be able to test end-to-end tests on Kubernetes. But that system's connected to CI. It's not directly available for developers as you're actually developing new functionality. There used to be a simulator mode in the real vCenter. It was removed in version 6.0, I believe. So that was nice. In some ways, you're able to basically mock just about all the functionality of vCenter and configure how many resource types you wanted for hosts, clusters, VMs, and so on. But the problem, other than it doesn't exist anymore, is that it still required a full vCenter installation. So you still have that issue with the time to boot and the hardware resource requirements. And of course, mock injection is always an option for this kind of stuff. That sort of thing is it's possible in Go. It can be tricky, but I think regardless of language, when you're doing mock injections, you end up kind of repeating a lot of things between projects, and the implementation of the mocks are kind of up to the person who's writing the test, and they can be problematic to maintain. So we came up with a new alternative, which we also called vcsim since the old one went away, although I kind of referred to it as Go vcsim at some point. So let's get into some of the details about that. So if you're not familiar with Go vMommy, or if you're familiar with the vCenter API, there's hundreds of manage objects, hundreds of methods. It's a very vast API, of which I've spent quite a bit of time with, but really probably only a small percentage. It just kind of keeps going, which can be good and bad. But kind of what we started with was we already had this generated code that's generated from the WSDL. So it includes every managed object, every method, all of the data types. And we had been using that strictly on the client side. And what we ended up doing was combining those types with just the Golang standard HTTP package, and basically turned it into, at least from the perspective of API clients, turned into a vCenter server that's written in Go. So other than actually wiring up those method types internally, all the state is actually stored in just a simple map, where the map key is managed object reference, and then the value is the instance of that object. And it's really simple, but it's actually really powerful the way that the vSphere model is that each of these objects also have pointers to their parents and children, and you essentially can build, you can traverse the entire object graph just by using a map. So when it comes to method invocations, any API request you make, at least the SOAP ones, they all start out with the same kind of signature. So there's method name, and then there's a field called this, and this points to manage object reference. So we use that map to dispatch those requests to the object implementation. And then those methods inside vcsim are going to change state. So for example, if you're powering on a VM, or if it's already powered on, it would return a fault in that case. And there's other methods that will add or remove objects, but they're essentially just changing state of the world. So one of the downsides, and in contrast to the vcsim mode of the old vCenter, we actually have to implement all of the methods. So right now there's a subset. I mentioned there's somewhere north of 800 methods in the 6.7 API, and that doesn't include things like SSO and lookup service and some of these other endpoints. So there's cases where you might be using vcsim and you run into an issue where there's a method that's not actually implemented, and we can take a closer look at how that's done later on. There's no persistence. That's by design. Part of what we actually want each time we run these tests is a clean slate. Persistence, if people are looking for that, could be achieved ways. But for now, that hasn't been a focus point in here. But when it comes to performance and scalability, We haven't focused on that at all yet. We haven't done any measurements or benchmarking or fine tuning. I think, maybe we'll look at that at some point too. But I think you'll see that once we get into some use cases, it's pretty good in its current form. So when it comes to using vcsim, there's two ways. One, there's a binary called vcsim, and that starts a server on a port of your choice, TCP port, and you can talk to it with any client, whether it's Go, Java, Python, Ruby.net, at least are the ones that I've heard folks have connected to vcsim. And a few of those languages, we had a few wrinkles to iron out when it comes to the XML encoding. Go, languages do those things differently, and Go tends to be a little more lenient than some of the other languages, but a lot of those have been ironed out. The tests for GoVC itself are written in bats. If you're not familiar with bats, it's basically bash with some annotations and a test harness and some nice things for testing that kind of stuff. And GoVC kind of duels as it's a useful CLI, but also kind of as a test harness for some of the GoVMami APIs. So there's, the majority of the test coverage for GoVC is via GoVC and bats talking to vcsim. The other way to use vcsim is to, if you're implementing in Go, to actually import the simulator package in your test files. And there's a pretty simple boilerplate to bring up a vcsim instance. And then, as you'll see when we get into some of those examples, you just talk to it with the client just like you would a real vCenter. So let me actually switch out here to do some demos. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so I'm going to start with just running vcsim, which is already running over here, so I need to kill it.
Hey, Doug, the looks like the screen is a little bit small, at least from my end.
Let me see.
Yeah, Fabio, when it's like that, I have to maximize my zoom window.
Is that better, or should I?
He's in 4 terminals. Maybe if you made one of the terminals the master terminal, Doug, it would be a bigger.
I can read it now. It's fine for me now. I wonder if
yeah, I'm gonna use all the panes here.
Mm-hmm.
Can you read it now, Andrew?
Oh, I could. I was just okay. I know what happens when it's too small for me. I have to maximize my zoom window.
So when you start vcsim, the output is the URL. So vcsim has the default of port 8989. When you use vcsim in Go test, there's always a random port that's chosen.
Hey, Doug, I have a question about I guess it's more about GoVMami, but it's applicable here too. It seems like the environment variables are specific to GoVMami and vcsim. Is there a particular reason that the environment variables, which seem to be standard across other projects, are not able to be used, like vsphere underscore server username password? Is it? I found that out accidentally when I was using it. I just was curious.
I don't know if those existed before GoVMami. So we actually created GoVMami and GoVC in August of 2014, and we created it for Kubernetes. And
gotcha.
At the time, the only provisioning way to provision it, other than manually, was with the kubeup shell script framework. And that still exists a little bit, but a lot of it is deprecated. So
no worries.
When you see vSphere underscore environment variables like in the end-to-end tests in Kubernetes. Those came later. I mean, we could probably look at both, but when it comes to this use case, so this is outputting it to the screen, but there's another option, -E, and you give it, if you point it at a FIFO, file that you created with make FIFO, then it'll actually write these environment variables to that, and then your program that's going to be talking to vcsim can read from that FIFO. So that you don't actually start trying to connect to vcsim until it's listening. And then the PID is in there, so you can actually kill vcsim after it's been backgrounded. So I have the environment set up here. So for authentication is required for vcsim, but you can use any username and password, and it does create a session. You can log out from that session, and there's also objects that are session specific. And then you can see the URL here is just the loopback 8989. And if we actually look at what's in here right now, oops. Okay, one too many environment variables. So this is kind of the default inventory. And you can also see, if you run vcsim-h, there's flags for number of hosts per cluster, number of standalone hosts, VMs, basically every resource type. So there's a small set for the default, but you can crank it up, or you can also turn it off. So if I say 0 data centers, then I have no inventory. But I can still connect to it, and I could start from scratch and say data center create foo, and there's my foo data center, all the data center folders, and then we put this default VM network in there by default as well. So let's actually crank it up here a little bit more. So let's say three data centers, and this is really where this comes in useful, right? So back to when you have your own vCenter environment, you might have one cluster, 3 hosts, 1 data center, but for testing, you want to be able to kind of model these different flavors of inventory that customers have, and typically, they might have more than 1 data center. Say 10 hosts per cluster, we'll add 3 clusters. The folder flag will actually put everything inside of a folder. That's something that sounds simple, but has been the source of bugs in many projects where, if you have a network inside of a subfolder or any type really, when it comes to locating it, that's kind of been an issue. So it's good to be able to easily test that. Pod is actually a data store cluster. And if you're not familiar with that, it's actually just an extension of the folder, but you can have data stores inside that folder to form a data store cluster. So now if we go back here, you can see there's a whole bunch more stuff, and I'll explain the naming here real quick. This was also borrowed from the original vCenter simulator mode. So basically, there's all the types have a prefix. So DC data center, and then under DC 0 we have host 0, VM 0. So they're not the most human friendly, but typically you're going to be doing this kind of testing automated, so that the names don't matter a whole lot. And of
And
course,
Doug,
yep.
I'm sorry. Please finish.
No, go ahead.
Um, when I ask a question, please tell me if it's something that we should refer to the docs for, since I know this is more of a deep dive. As you get into this, two things have come to mind: the hidden APIs. I'm sure you've had to implement some of it for like the multi-DC, multi vCenter mode. But the other one that came to mind was, does this support record and playback so that you could generate raw requests if you had need for such a thing?
There's no, but it would be possible to.
Yeah, it should be fairly, I mean, I won't say simple, but I mean, at some point you're receiving those. So to be able to write them out wouldn't be, I think, it might be an issue worth filing that you or I could look at.
Yeah, no, the ideas come up before, and at least one of our users of vcsim, they have a product. It's a commercial product, but it actually uses the property collector to mirror the inventory. So they have their own database outside of vCenter, and they can use the property collector to basically watch for new inventory items, removed inventory items, and then any changes that happen to existing ones.
Yeah.
So that sort of thing could be used for that, but we don't have anything in place yet.
So something while you're showing this that I wanted to raise, this is in a different actual repo, even though you're executing it with a command from the Go vMommy repository, the actual simulator code is in a different repository. Isn't that correct?
No, it's all in Go vMommy.
Oh, okay. Never mind. I guess it was a different package. My bad.
Yeah, it's just a different package.
Sorry. I don't know why I thought it was a different repo.
And by the way, it's fine to ask any questions, because originally this was intended as like an intro and overview, but then Fabio called it deep dive on the calendar invite, but I think we can do a little bit of both.
I mean, you may want to repeat this as a tech talk.
Yeah, no, definitely.
You've already made the presentation.
So while we're chatting, and these other two panes down here, I ran GoVC events -F. So this is actually following the event manager. That's another feature that's supported in vcsim, but requires, I mentioned that the methods are implemented manually. So the method implementations actually need to emit these events. And I'm sure there's cases of events where we're not emitting and we should add them, but there's enough in there for some of the common cases. And then over here is tasks -F. So I'm actually following all of the new tasks that are going to be happening. And so if we go up here, and let's actually just say, so I want to find just virtual machines. So I can actually say GoVC VM info. Take this guy. Okay, so inventory passes looks just like it does against the real vCenter. There's no IP address. That's another thing that we can think about down the road. But right now it's it's powered on. So if we say VM power -off, so you can see down here, following the task manager, we have the power off task that was successful, and then likewise in the events, we have two events. One is that it's stopping, and then that it's actually powered off. If we try to power it off again, we're going to get back an invalid power state fault, return to the client, and then you can also see in the task that's actually an error. The error doesn't get reflected in events. And then if we want, we can go ahead and actually destroy this thing. And you can see there's a couple other events that happen in here. So actually deleting the virtual disk goes through Virtual Disk Manager. And then there's a file that got deleted by the file manager. So a lot of the method implementations internally use the various manager types where appropriate to actually do the work. I should show you, it'll be a little bit easier here.
Doug?
Yep.
Just a quick question, since it's related to the methods and events. Is it possible, and I'm assuming it is, that between different vCenter versions, 6.0, 6.5, 6.7, events change, types change, like return types change, meaning that vcsim would need a flag which kind of version it simulates?
Yeah, we haven't done that yet.
I'm imagining the size of the binary if you maintained a backwards compatibility.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about which version we are simulating here. Always latest vCenter, or?
Well, that's a good question. Let's check.
I mean, hasn't the SDK, and y'all would know better than me, but at least up through 3, that's when I was into it pretty hard. It worked pretty hard to maintain backwards compatibility through additive classes. Did they start breaking that?
Well, so with a new version, pretty much nothing ever goes away unless it's marked as internal. In which case, we're not supposed to be using it at all.
Yeah.
And then when things are added, so if a new field gets added, that field is going to be optional in the WSDL.
Yeah.
If a new method gets added, that's something that. So I think right now I don't think there's anything 6.7 specific. I don't think we have any 6.7 specific methods.
What I was trying to imagine was Michael's case. I think it might be if you wrote some code against a simulator that you wanted to verify worked for, let's say, 6.5.
Yes, exactly.
You might be using a method that's only available in 6.7, and because the simulator supports that. So it would work for like old code, but it might get you into a position where your code assumes support for something that's not really there. That could probably be done via, I mean, it would require a lot of type information now.
Yeah, I mean, that's another future item. We do a little bit of that when you can run vcsim in ESX mode. So there's a -ESX flag, and that actually is aware that it's in ESX mode. So there's certain things that are disabled, which includes, like, you can't create folders in ESX, for example. And some of that's transparent just through the, some of the structures that are used to pre-populate this stuff. There's ways to have methods disabled on objects. There's an actual field called disabled methods. But for versioning would be a different story. But if the demand is there, then we can definitely look at doing that. Just not there now.
Well, what also would work is if you have different releases for vcsim and GoVC. So if you just make a table like this is tested against, or like it has methods for 6.7, so it could break on 6.5, like the Go SDK for Kubernetes, the Go client.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, Michael. I mean,
and it's an easy one, right?
Well, it should even be potentially backwards doable. Like Doug or somebody could go back and figure out which releases of GoVC, GoVMon supports which, and then tag those at additional like vCenter versions or something.
Yeah, that would help, because if I understand this presentation correct, then going forward we want to make vcsim the tool for testing for most cases, at least, so that we should have version capabilities or compatibilities listed, I think.
I already filed one issue, Doug. Okay. If you're okay with that, I'll go ahead and file Michael's idea as another, or at least in a general sense, and then maybe even suggest that idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah.
Please do. So I just wanted to show the data store capability a little bit. So um, I'm in Emacs now. There's a little Emacs mode for GoVC, but under the covers, it's just running GoVC commands. So I mentioned there's no persistence. Like everything is in memory, but there are some files on disk. So for each VM, there's a directory just like there is on Real vCenter. And then a couple of the files that you're used to seeing, like the VMX, VMDK, they're all empty, but they're there because there are projects or products that actually look at some of these files, and there's a log with not a whole lot of info, but enough that you can actually grab that log. So I just ran a GoVC data store tail, and that shows you what's actually in that file. And then if I actually delete this guy, which one was that? VM0. And I go back to the data store. That I thought I deleted that. You know what? I'll just delete all of them. Let's see what happens. Yeah, so everything's gone now from the data store. So, as far as the inventory, so like I pointed out that there's switches to configure a number of things, and then in the cases where those don't work, you can manipulate the inventory with the API. So I showed how to create a data center. Let's actually do that again, and just let's see, type data center. So there's foo, but I actually wanted that in a folder. So I'll actually say create / Doug M. I can actually move my data center to that folder, and then with the find, you can see it moved under that folder. So those sorts of things are there's cases where they might not have support for some of those operations, but the basic ones are pretty much there. Any questions on that stuff?
Yeah, I have one for the releases. Do we maintain official brew and Docker images? Was there an issue for that?
Not yet. Fabio had recently converted us to use Go Releaser, and that's one of its features.
Cool.
Is that you can configure to publish those.
Yes. Okay. Cool.
But we
although it should be, almost embarrassingly simple to build. It's pure Go, right? There's no.
Yeah.
There's
that's right.
Yeah, he vendors dependencies, so.
What I mean is, instead of everyone doing it, just have it like in GoVC as the releases is. But if they change to Go Releaser, then we kind of get it already.
Sure.
Yeah, I was actually. If you guys want to create an issue for that, I can and assign it to me. Actually, I will work on that because right now we're just producing all the artifacts for GoVC, not for vcsim. But we also have, in the GoVMommy repo, we also have vcsim and toolbox, which is another thing entirely. And we may want to have artifacts created for them as well every release. So
cool, we'll do.
Nice to track that.
Yep, good.
So super quick, just inside, we're in vcsim main. It's less than 200 lines of code, and most of it is mapping options to this model object. And you'll see this model object next when we get into the Go tests. And all this thing really is a counter for each of the object types, so data center host and so on. So in vcsim you can tweak those with command line flags, and in the Go tests you can actually just change this model object directly before you actually start the service. And there's a couple of these default models. So one is ESX. And really the main difference between ESX mode and VPX mode is the service content and root folder and the values of those fields. And of course, ESX doesn't support a lot of these fields, so they're just set to 0 for ESX. And when this model is actually created, which you also see this call in any of the tests that are using it inside of Go, basically there's a mega method here with lots of for loops. So ignore that ugliness part, but the important thing here is that these are all actually using the Go vMommy client. Where's the client? Well, okay, it's actually using the in-memory client. There's a in-memory implementation of, there's a SOAP interface called Round Tripper, but you could replace this with the Vim 2.5 client that actually connects over TCP, and all the method calls are the same. So on to example tests in Go. So there's a couple examples that are in the tree as Go examples. So these actually show up in the Go docs. So most of these are kind of some of the boilerplate examples. So you're always going to need a context, and typically in the test it's just context background. And then this model that I pointed at for this example is ESX. And we defer model remove, and that's just to clean up the files that are in the data store that we looked at earlier, and removes the local directory for the data store itself. And then model create was what we were just looking at, that actually populates the model. And then service.new server is what will actually start the HTTP server, and it'll be on a random port by default. And then we defer a close to that, so it just shuts down, closes the socket. And when you call this, it actually sets the URL field. So this URL field will include the random port, and then you can connect to it with the Go vMommy client. And this particular test just outputs the API type and then the number of hosts. And if you haven't seen these Go examples, this last line here is the output to expect. So when you actually run it, it runs it as a test. And if we were to change this to something else, then it's gonna fail. And this is just another example of the model where you can tweak the number of things. So up here I set data center to 0, just like when we ran the binary and set -DC equal to 0. So when we do that, we won't have any inventory, so we can expect host to be 0. And again, if I change that to 1, this test is going to fail. And you can also see it, the whole thing starts fairly quickly. Again, haven't really done benchmarks, but I looked briefly, and it's usually a few tenths of a second to start up, so not too bad. And then this is just boilerplate for VPX. So when you're actually implementing a new test, VPX is the most common model, and for Kubernetes, we don't support talking directly to ESX, so you can kind of ignore that in that context. But really, you can just copy copy this little bit as your boilerplate template to get started with new tests. Any questions on that?
Yeah, so that's interesting. You said that we don't support Kubernetes with just ESX. Why is that?
Probably because it's a pain to test.
Okay.
Well, there's a couple reasons, and part of it's related to storage. So there is code, at least in the entry, that depends on the policy-based or storage policy-based management, and that's vCenter only. There's other things like SSO or vCenter. If you're familiar with the Vic project, you might know that trying to support both can cause a lot of problems. So okay, so let's actually go into a test that I just implemented yesterday. So at least some of you are aware that recently in the what will be Kubernetes 1.12, we started adding support for zones in the vSphere cloud provider, and there was some work to some first steps we had to do in Go vMommy. We didn't have any bindings for the tagging API. So I mentioned the generated code before, and that's all for the SOAP API that's from the WSDL, but there's what's called vAPI or VMware Automation API, and it is not SOAP, it's REST, and it's for a lot of the functionality a subset of what SOAP can do, but it's also a superset in that it's the only API binding for a few of these features. One is tagging, another is content library, and there's a couple others for just managing vCenter itself. So we decided to, and there's not, at least not that I know of, a full Go client for that API. So we added bindings just for the tagging API, but also did it in a way that we'll be able to add some of those others that aren't available in SOAP. But when we did that, we didn't, so there weren't actually any tests that went with this original implementation of zones. So I just wanted to kind of walk through that a little bit. This config from sim is essentially that boilerplate that we were just looking at. So simulator VPX, create the model, create the server, and it actually returns a function to do the cleanup below. And then these things you also see in the vcsim main. So we add there's a simulator for secure token service. It's a different endpoint from the main SOAP API. And it's also a different calling convention, if you want to call it that. It's SOAP, but it's different from the main V model. And then for vAPI, again, that's not SOAP at all, but we can pretty easily connect it to our HTTP multiplexer or router, so we can handle that particular path a different way than we do for SOAP. Another endpoint is the lookup service. And so lookup service can be used for actually finding where the STS service lives and a couple other things. Lookup service does not require authentication. And it does a whole bunch of other stuff, but for Kubernetes, we only care about being able to look up the secure token service. And then, Andrew, here's some of the environment variables I think you were referring to. But basically, we're just taking, setting the Kubernetes vSphere cloud provider config fields to values from the simulator. And then some of the defaults, like test default data center is DC0. And that was, another goal with those models and naming is that you have some stable names that you can use for these kind of tests. So that's basically setting up the instance. This new controller mode, node, I won't dig into, but that's just more initialization of the VCP structures. And then this particular test, we're setting, these are two of the new fields related to zones. So there's region and zone. And then this guy actually grabs the vSphere instance for the vCenter IP, connects to it. And then what we're going to do here before we actually start testing things is get a reference to the data center. We're going to look up one of the fields that was set is VM UUID. And I won't go back to it, but I guess another point to make with the tests that are written in Go, you can use the client over TCP, but you also have direct access to the simulator inventory in memory. So there's I mentioned that there's a map that holds everything. That map has a method called any, so you can say just give me any VM or any host system, and then that saves your test code a little bit of actually trying to look up those objects when you don't care if it's a specific instance. Property collector instances is kind of a standard thing. So what we're going to actually do here is have an instance of tag manager. So that's the new API I mentioned. We're going to create the category for the region, and then create a tag with that category, Kate's region US, and then likewise for zone, create another category, another tag. And of course, you can do this stuff against real vCenter, but then you need to also take care of cleaning up these labels and categories, when you're done. But with vcsim, it just all goes away when the process goes away. And then I put another random tag in here that has nothing to do with zones, partly because in implementing these tests, I found a couple bugs, and one of them was if you did have a tag that wasn't the zone or the region, actually reset another field and lost track of the other tags I had looked up. So that's a good thing. So we're able to kind of bake that in here and always be able to test that. And then these tags, at this point, I've only attached the tag to the random ID to the host. So a quick sanity check that zones is actually implemented. So before this feature was put in, zones would return false. And then I have a table of tests. So there's three fields here. One's the name. So if something goes wrong, it'll just output that name. And then fail. If fail is true, then we're expecting an error. If it's false, then we're expecting it to succeed. And then prep is just a little function to do any prep work before running the actual test. So the first time through, we don't have any tags attached. So we're expecting the test to fail. The next time through, we're going to prepare by attaching the region tag, but there's no zone tag, so we're expecting that to fail. Next time through, so region ID, host ID, same kind of thing, but just attaching the zone tag. And then on the next test, we're actually going to go and detach those tags. So these tags are attached to the host. And then in the next one, so one of the enhancements that we discussed making for this feature is that instead of requiring that the tags are attached to the host, that you can put them anywhere in the inventory hierarchy. So what this test is preparing here is that it's actually going to look up the parent of the host, and it's going to attach the region tag to the data center, and then attach the zone tag to the cluster. But we have this set true to fail because we haven't actually implemented that. But that's going to be my next step for this test, is actually implement that feature, and then I'll be changing that true to false, expecting it to succeed. And then, you know, actually running through that table is just each time calling prepare the test, get the zone, and then checking if we're supposed to fail or not. So if I actually run that, currently passes. There's a little bit of logging output down there. But when we go to work on this enhancement, we're going to change this to false. And since we haven't yet, that's going to fail. Any questions on that? Okay. So we actually have we have four minutes left. That was the majority of stuff I wanted to get through on today's call. We can move on to looking actually inside of the implementation of vcsim if people are interested, or if folks have anything else they wanted to look at, just let me know.
Hey, Dank.
Yeah.
Thank you, first of all, for taking the time. I think it's really useful. But since I'm a starter in vcsim and all the SDK and calls, like in the code, I see references to vclib, property collector, like different libraries and packages being called and used. Is there a call graph or introduction on kind of how to, like a skeleton of functions that are always needed when implementing code against vcsim or vcenter? It's just the basics.
Well,
there's no basics for the SDK.
Well, I mean,
I see.
Yeah, and that would be, I mean, we could do a separate like
that is interesting.
SDK overview.
Yeah, I wonder if people, maybe that would be useful as another tech talk, Doug, because I mean, we've gotten further away from the SDK over the years, but once you start really playing with a simulator, it probably helps to know what exactly is going on. Yeah. I remember property collection was always traversal specs. I have nightmares.
Yeah, that is actually the most nightmarish part of implementing vcsim is the and likewise for the client side, it's it can be complex, but it's also you know, pretty powerful. So
it is. I had to do the same thing for the 70K, and I couldn't use an ORM. It just didn't scale.
Yeah. So, but back to your question, Michael. So, you know, again, for vcsim, this boilerplate up here is kind of the bare bones for just starting an instance. And then when it comes to using the SDK, these examples use go vmami new client, but that's really just a combination of SOAP client and Vim 2.5 client with a few shortcuts around it. But let me actually go to one of the tests for a simulator itself. So some of these. So here's a test where I want to reconfigure a virtual machine device. I chose ESX here just because there's less stuff to have to look up. So for example, ESX only has one data center. So you can always use that instead of having to search for data center. But again, here's go vmami new client. We have Finder is one way to navigate the inventory. There's other ways. There's a view manager, and there's a couple of view manager types. But in a lot of cases we're using Finder. It's a little bit more flexible. But this actually gets the list of every VMs or every VM. I think this was implemented before that any method that I mentioned, but functionally still the same. Gets the list of virtual machine devices. So all these, these methods are the same SDK, or at least underneath. Some of these are wrappers around things like property collector.
I see. Yeah.
But you would see some of these like in the VCP code. So vclib is vSphere Cloud Provider's kind of utility package for wrapping up some of this stuff, and you'll find that in like Vic had one. It was called Session, and most projects end up with one of those. And really, from what I've seen, most of those will take the product specific or project specific configuration and map that to some of these API calls. So like the connection information, which data center you want to use, which data store, and that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, they end up calling the same methods.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And I just wanted to throw this out. So it seems to be pretty popular these days to do live coding sessions. Doug, since you write a lot of tests and GoVMomi specific stuff, would you be open for that? Like, so people can tune in and just watch you and learn as you go?
Yeah, I mean, I
was waiting for Doug to say, "Well, Andrew's interested."
Well, that's part of the reason I wanted to walk through the vSphere test from yesterday. Although if I had done this one live, I wouldn't necessarily know, how long it would take, and it did take that long. I think we could have pretty easily done it within an hour. But yeah, we could plan on doing that in a separate session.
Yeah, I mean, no pressure. If it's not convenient for you, then not. It's just like learning as you write and go through. That probably is the best exercise for me and others.
Yeah, no, I don't mind. And actually, when it comes to one of my favorite features of vcsim is that it actually makes writing tests fun, for me anyway. And it's not just testing for the sake of quality and maintenance down the road. It's like just kind of the initial development. And I'm not a TDD person where you're expected to actually write the test first. For me, in a lot of cases, I might start against a real vCenter and then get a little bit of hello world kind of going on, and then just kind of mold it into one of these tests. So yeah, we could definitely do that.
Cool. Yeah, would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. We're 3 minutes over. I guess we can spend another 2-3 minutes if there are any other questions open. Otherwise, we can wrap up. All right.
Okay.
Going once, twice. Thank you, Doug. That was very helpful. And yeah, well, given that there was a lot of interest, maybe we'll figure out if we can have like a second one on vcsim, maybe do like some more detailed testing. Maybe a live coding session, maybe. Not promising anything. I'm not volunteering you for anything right now. But yeah, that was very cool. Thanks, and thanks everybody for showing up. See you guys at the next meeting.
All right. Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.